in a while we're going to do of the UFO lectures. I just want to explain to you why the Spring Valley Library invited Mr. Lear to talk on UFOs. If any of you are familiar with the bestseller lists, you can see many UFO-related books on it. The one in particular I'm thinking of is Communion. We have several other programs here at the library. We have gardening lectures. I know not quite as exciting as UFOs, but still nonetheless. We also have classic movies on a regular basis. We also, outside on the display table, you'll see several MUFON UFO journals. Those are carried at the main library down on Flamingo, the Clark County Library. You can check out the ones that are out there now. If you want any more in the future, you'll have to go down there. I want to thank in advance Mr. Tad Rice, who is providing us with the sound tonight. He's doing an excellent job, and we are most grateful for his assistance. I'd also in advance like to thank Mr. John Lear, who has taken a lot of time in setting up these lectures for you. He's a very busy man, and we're quite appreciative. I'd like to introduce Mr. Lear. Mr. Lear is 45. He's a captain for a major charter airline and has flown 160 different types of aircraft in over 50 different countries. He held 17 world speed records in the Learjet, including speed around the world set in 1966, and is the only pilot ever to hold every airman certificate issued by the Federal Aviation Administration. These certificates include airline transport rating, flight instructor, ground instructor, navigator, engineer, dispatcher, airframe and power plant mechanic, control tower operator, and parachute rigger. In addition to this, he holds the PATCO Award for Outstanding Airmanship, presented in 1968 in the Simons Wave Memorial. Lear has flown missions worldwide for the CIA and other government agencies. He flew in Southeast Asia between 1966 and 1973 and has extensive experience in Europe, the Middle East, Afghanistan, the Far East, Africa, the Pacific, and Atlantic Oceans. He has also flown experimental and production test flights for the Learjet Corporation and other companies. As a non-skid pilot, he has flown for 28 different airline companies in the past 25 years. Lear, who has 4 daughters, who lives in Las Vegas with his wife Mary Lee, a former actress, and his 2 youngest children, Allison 14 and Jacqueline 10. His hobbies include carpentry and gardening. Please welcome Mr. John Lear.
Thank you. I used to be interested in spy planes, and I started flight instructing down around Van Nuys Airport in 1964, and that was about the time that the Blackbirds started up, the SR-71 that some of you know as. And it was a really exciting time. The Blackbird was built by Lockheed, and had some friends that would roll into the restaurant that we all attended there, the Sky Trails, and of course they couldn't tell us much about it. But we knew what they were doing, and every Monday morning Lockheed had these 3 old Constellations, and they'd take off with the engineers, and they'd drone up out of the valley there through the Newhall Pass, and we'd watch them take off and leave, and we knew it was full of engineers, and we knew they were doing exciting things with exciting airplanes. And then Friday night they'd all come back. About 4 o'clock, these 3 Connies had come back from wherever they went, probably up here in Nevada somewhere. And then 1966, I went to Southeast Asia. I spent several years there flying for a private company, and continued my interest in airplanes. 1973, moved to Nevada, worked for a couple airlines. 1975, went over to Beirut, worked for a large cargo airline over there. And then 1977, came back here, and it's about the time they started up the stealth fighter program. And that was an exciting thing, too, and we'd watch the little snippets you'd see in the newspaper about the pilots bailing out. And I remember one in particular, the pilot bailed out up there at the test site, and he showed up at one of the hospitals here with still in his parachute rig. And that was, I think that was Bill Park. Anyway, then in 1980, went over to Cairo and spent a couple years over there doing some interesting flying, and still keeping my interest in airplanes. Then came back here in 1983, and one thing I would tell you, when I was over in Cairo, in 1978 when the Camp David Accords were signed, each country, Israel and Egypt, agreed to operate a flight into the other country 4 times a week. Well, El Al, the Israeli airline, they didn't mind flying into Egypt, but you could not find an Egyptian that would fly into Israel. So Egypt Air hired an American airplane with American crew to pretend they were Egyptians to fly in to do their 4 flights. And I was the guy. I was the pilot that did that. And it turns out that one day in 1981, El Al went on strike. And for some reason, they had to make a flight from Tel Aviv to Istanbul. Well, it turns out that the owner of our company had close ties in there, so when we finished the one trip to Tel Aviv before we went back to Cairo, I ran the trip to Istanbul for El Al, and thus became the only captain ever to have flown for El Al and Egypt Air in the same day in the same airplane. In 1983, I came back here and worked for, got with a major charter carrier, fly L-1011, captain on L-1011. And 1985 was the beginning of this whole mess. A friend of mine flew for the Air Force, and he was a Raven. The Ravens were the people, were the gung-ho guys in Southeast Asia. They took them out of the Air Force and made them civilians, and they flew for the United States ambassador in Laos, and they flew forward air control up in northern Laos, central Laos, over the PDJ, the Plain of Jars, and they were really a gung-ho bunch. There's a book on the newsstands now called Ravens, and he was my friend was one of those guys. He came through Nellis, he was going to retire, and he came over to the house, sat, had a few drinks. We're talking about, the good old days in Laos. We were both there together, and I said, where all have you been based since I saw you last? And he mentioned a few places, and he mentioned Bentwaters. Well, Bentwaters on December 30th, 1980 was where a flying saucer landed, and 3 little aliens got out, walked up to the base commander, who was the United States Air Force Colonel at that time, Colonel Gordon Williams. And I'd heard about this, but I was never, really all that interested. But to have Greg Wilson tell me, he said Bentwaters, and I said, oh, that's supposedly where that flying saucer crashed. And he said, no, John, not supposedly, or landed. He said, no, John, not supposedly, it did. He said, now, I didn't see it because I was confined to quarters, but I know the guys who did. If you meet up with them, ask them. There's General Williams, Gordon Williams, Colonel Chuck Halt, and Colonel Ted Conrad. Well, I never ran into those guys, but I ran into some other guys, some security police by the name of Larry Warren, Clifford Stone, and Adrian Bustinza, who were part of about 30 people who stood perimeter guard around this flying saucer when the aliens got out. And I got to thinking, when Greg told me this, you mean all this stuff is true? You mean there are flying saucers, there are aliens? You mean the government's been lying to us all this time? You mean NASA has been lying, all this stuff is really true? And I got to thinking, God, I'd sure like to find out. Well, all my life, I've really been gung-ho on stuff, from when I got all my ratings of the FAA, I wasn't satisfied just to get the flying ones. I had to get everything, and same thing with airplanes. I can't fly, just a couple, I got to fly them all. And then I got to thinking, if there is something to this, I'm going to find out what it is. So about a year ago, I launched on this program to get the bottom of flying saucers and find out if they did exist. So I've been working on since last, about July, and then I started in earnest. I took some time off from my job, took about 7 months off, and I really got into it. Made a lot of phone calls, made a lot of meets, talked to a lot of people. November 1st, I got into my truck. I took some video equipment, some audio equipment, some cameras, and I drove throughout Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, talking to anybody and everybody who would talk to me. Started at Kirtland Air Force Base there with Colonel Ernie Edwards, who heads security police, and one lead to another. And when I got back in December and I realized that I had found the truth, I realized 2 things. Number 1, nobody would ever believe me. And number 2, that I better get on with my life and go back to flying, or it really caused me some problems. So I did. I went back to flying, and the way I resolved this conflict within myself, knowing the big secret and not being able to tell anybody, is to go out and give little lectures like this. It's not a crusade. I'm not trying to, get my ideas on forcing on anybody. I talk to little groups. I talk to groups this size. I hardly ever leave Las Vegas to talk. It's just resolving my own inner thing on this. So tonight, I'd like to tell you a little bit about what I found out, and I'm going to start with the Bentwaters tape. HBO went over there in 1984, and they interviewed Larry Warren. They spent $500,000. They did a 5-part documentary that came out in 1984. Nobody ever listened to it. And on Bentwaters, and the 5th one was on Larry Warren, who's my friend, lives in New Haven, Connecticut. He was one of the Air Force security cops that was standing right there and watched the aliens get out. So what I'd like to do here is just start this tape and have you look at this HBO presentation.
What appears to be a beam coming down to the ground. This is unreal.
On the Halt tape, he and others continued to observe the objects for several hours, and Halt noted it in his report. Colonel Halt would not comment officially to CNN about these strange incidents. In my next report, an account is told by this former airman, Larry Warren, who alone says he saw entities emerge from the UFO.
My first impression is that I thought they were children, because my mind wouldn't accept what I was seeing. I thought they were children in snowsuits.
This is Chuck DeCaro, CNN Special Assignments.
Has an Air Force document and a tape recording made during one of 2 reported UFO sightings.
And today, our correspondent, Chuck DeCaro, talks with one former Air Force man who says he witnessed beings from the UFO.
My first impression is that I thought they were children, because my mind wouldn't accept what I was seeing. I thought they were children in snowsuits.
Larry Warren says he's willing to risk ridicule to tell about his encounter with what he says appeared to be alien beings. Larry Warren is today a sales representative for a medical company living and working in a typical suburban community. But a little over 4 years ago, as an enlisted man in the U.S. Air Force, he claims he had a most untypical experience when he came face to face with something he admits he has trouble describing. Warren was assigned to security at the Bentwaters Woodbridge Air Force Base complex in England. He says he was a witness to the second of 2 UFO encounters on succeeding days in the forest separating the 2 bases. And CNN has found, except for Warren's description of the alien beings, others who were there who have given strikingly similar accounts of the UFOs.
Well, it was predominantly, it looked like a fire at first. That's what we thought it was. So it was more like a red or reddish-orange color, but it had other colors moving around in it.
We saw flying objects containing maybe other people or another life form.
There were a number of different phenomena seen. A triangular luminous flying object with a red light on top and a series of blue lights underneath. A circular translucent ground-hugging disc. Various lights moving erratically about the night sky, one of which occasionally beamed a shaft of white light downward, and a luminous pulsating red-orange sphere.
Didn't look solid at all. It just looked like a self-admitted, piece of light. It was just odd. It seemed like it was no sooner there that it blew up. Not outward or upward, it just blew down with all these sparkles and different colors of light. Indescribable, because it's beyond me how this happened. We weren't injured by it, and I was very close, and it changed, and that was the weirdest thing about it. It changed into the ship that people had seen earlier. The 3 cops had followed out there.
Warren's description of the transformed object appears to match what 3 airmen reportedly saw at the same location the night before. But Warren's story takes an even stranger twist.
At that point, we saw people, or whatever you want to call them, coming out. They didn't come out. There were no doors or anything on the ship. These things moved out. There were 3 of them, and they were covered with, they had light around them. And they came out, they stood there, and they actually floated to make it more complicated. Beings, exactly. No threatening motions were made at us by them. They didn't communicate with me at all. Our base commander was there, Who's the base commander? Lieutenant Colonel Gordon Williams.
The official Air Force response is that Williams, now a general, did not witness the alleged incident. Air Force for information about the Bentwaters UFO incident 6 months ago. Throughout, the Air Force has been slow to respond. And when it did reply, the answer was usually, quote, unknown, end quote, or in some cases apparently misleading. For example, when CNN asked, are there any photographs, tape recordings, videotapes, drawings, or descriptions of any kind in Air Force files, the official U.S. Air Force reply was, quote, there was no audiovisual documentation done, end quote. However, as we reported earlier in this series, there was an audio tape made during the second of 2 UFO encounters. CNN has also found an officer who says he drove the base commander to a waiting airplane to deliver what he was told was a motion picture film of one of the UFOs.
We drove out and I asked him what was in the film. He said, this is and we actually have the picture of the UFO here. And he got off the Jeep, went to the aircraft, handed the film to the pilot, the canopy closed, and the aircraft took off. I asked him where it was headed, and he said, Germany.
Larry Fawcett says he thinks the Air Force could be involved in a cover-up.
Number one, they've been telling the public for 30 years there's no such thing as UFOs. How can they reverse themselves now and say there is, and they've been lying and covering it up?
If it is a cover-up, then the American public may never know what those airmen saw at Bentwaters in 1980. If they were merely Keystone cops who were hallucinating, as one critic suggests, then what are the national security implications of those same airmen guarding a strategically important airbase where nuclear weapons are reportedly stored? If they weren't hallucinating, then what are the implications of what they actually did see? When CNN recently asked the Air Force about the possible existence of movie film of the Bentwaters UFO, the official Air Force response was, the United States Air Force stopped investigating UFOs in 1969. This is Chuck DeCaro, CNN.
You want to bet? Let's take a poll here. How many folks believe in UFOs? What a dumb question. Okay. The other thing is, how many believe that the government can cover up something if they want to? Well, we're going to get along real swell today. This is... When I got back, I found out that behind everything that I researched was a very extensive government program known as mind control. Everybody's been in it for 40 years. We've all been totally brainwashed. It was the largest, most comprehensive mind control program in the history of mankind. And that's why most people think of flying saucers as a joke. This nation has been systematically and thoroughly brainwashed to believe that they don't exist. Ridicule. Ridicule is defined as words or actions intended to evoke contemptuous laughter at a person or thing. Fear of ridicule is the primary emotion on which the government's mind control program was based, and it was extremely effective. We have been conditioned to think of extraterrestrials in terms of science fiction fantasy, as easily controlled as a television set. The distances are too great, the time to travel unimaginable, the speed of light, blah, blah, blah. The serious news media leans over backwards to avoid mentioning the subject in any way except facetiously. TV and tabloids operate a censorship in reverse by exaggerating and sensationalizing the facts of case histories. They reduce them to absurdities. The Las Vegas Sun bent over backwards to misrepresent and otherwise distort the facts I gave them in a 5-hour interview. Deborah Brady, or Brad, or whatever it is, Channel 3, made sure the audience saw her rolling her eyes at my last lecture. Raphael Tamarillo of the Las Vegas Review-Journal wrote a totally ignorant editorial based on zero knowledge of available documents. He says he'll believe in aliens when he sees one in a zoo. And I want to ask you this, Raphael. From which side of the bars do you think you'll be looking? Well, let me tell you something. Our survival, yours and mine, depend on our ability to recognize that we have been duped by an inept government and military into believing that there is no threat and that flying saucers do not exist. And for those of you who believe they do exist, but entertain the simplistic belief that they are all our benevolent space brothers here to guide us into a battle-free utopian society, this fails to correlate with the known facts of numerous case histories. Here's what one Navy captain involved in the cover-up said to Ray Stanford, an eminent UFO researcher, and this Navy captain caught Stanford with a piece of UFO material that came off the Socorro incident. This is what he said to Stanford when he's getting the stuff back from him. He says, "You have no right to that dynamite. What do you want to do, blow up the whole economy, the entire social structure, and every other institution worth keeping?" Those in a position to know are under no delusion. They know the facts. People are not ready to know the facts, and they have no need to know the facts. They could, half of the people go off the deep end. Stanford asked the captain if those in the know had cracked up after learning the truth. "Well, I doubt it," he was told, "but those men are trained to meet and accept crises. They are capable of rational judgment in the face of the unexpected. Their decisions are based on experience in considering the welfare of larger groups of people. That provides experience and discernment that the average man, even the UFO researcher, never has." Well, isn't that special? Giordano Bruno got burned at the stake in the year 1600 for daring to say that the sun does not revolve around the earth. Even though he was correct, people did not want to hear it. The church did not want to hear it. And the fact that the earth revolves around the sun was successfully suppressed for another 200 years. It eventually caused a major upheaval in the church, government, and thought. A realignment of social and traditional values. Today, I'm telling you that the U.S. government has been in business with little gray extraterrestrials for over 20 years. We made a deal, and we got double-crossed. Fortunately for my efforts to get you the truth, all I'm getting is a little ridicule. But let me tell you my story, and you can make up your own mind whether or not it's true. I'm not selling a book. I don't charge for lectures, and I only lecture if I'm invited. I don't try to force my ideas onto others, but obviously since you're here tonight, you want to listen to what I have to say. In its effort to protect democracy, our government made a deal with these aliens, but we were double-crossed. And the government believes that it's absolutely, vitally important that you don't find out anything about it until they can get things under control. But I believe that you have the right to know how screwed up things have gotten. It is your right as an American, and it's your right as a human. The available evidence indicates that we've had a wide variety of visitors, over 70 different species in fact. They all have different types of motivation for being here, and different ways of interacting with us. Some have had us under surveillance since deep antiquity. Some have periodically stimulated our development with genetic experiments. You say, stimulated us with genetic experiments? Well, how do they do that? In 1986, a doctor in London, head of the Department of Genetics at one of the hospitals there, did an amniocentesis on a lady there. As we all know, an amniocentesis is where they withdraw fluid from the amniotic fetal sac of baby, unborn baby, and they look at the fluid to see if there's any disease or anything. So he pulls out this fluid, he puts it under the microscope, and he sees a little speck. So he puts it under an electron microscope, keeps blowing it up, enlarging it further and further and further, until he gets it big enough to see what it is. And what he finds is a little computer chip attached to the chromosome. Now this page here is from Nature magazine. It's one of Britain's most respected scientific journals. These 7 doctors wrote a letter to anybody in the world that could tell them what was going on. And at the end they say, if anybody is able to suggest an answer to this mystery, we would like to have it. We are as intrigued as we are ignorant. There's the original picture there. Those are chromosomes, and that's the little computer chip. That's how some of the genetic engineering is done. In the past 4 years, there have been 9,000 sightings of enormous crafts swooping low over the Hudson Valley in New York. Last October and November, there was 4,000 recorded sightings of a craft larger than a 747 flying slowly over Wytheville, Virginia, reported variously as huge triangles or disc-shaped objects. Hundreds of sightings in Texarkana in the past few months. On March 4th, 1988, in Pensacola, Florida, the ABC affiliate presented a 30-minute documentary showing 36 clear photos in 1 minute and 38 seconds of an extraterrestrial craft. Only the people in Pensacola got to see that because our news is controlled. The major networks are controlled by a organization called MJ12, which I'll tell you about in just a minute. But I'd like to tell you a little bit about this documentary. In November, a Gulf Breeze resident, he's a contractor there, got these photos, and he took it to the newspaper, who took it to the TV studio, and they thought, God, this is great. I mean, this is ironclad evidence. Polaroid shots, very difficult to fake a Polaroid, and video of this thing flying. But they said if we release it now, the public's going to cry fraud. So what we'll do is we'll spend about 3 months, and we'll authenticate the videotape, and we'll establish the credibility of the witness, which they did, and then they released it in this videotape March 4th, 1988. And I'm just going to show you just one portion of it. You can get an idea of what we're talking about.
Things were very normal around the house. Just a normal evening. My wife says she's got to run to the store. Anyway, I'm sitting at my desk. Out the window, I noticed something, a glow. I got up and walked around outside and looked. It just didn't look like a helicopter or an airplane. I realized that it was not something normal. I thought of calling the police. And I said, well, I better take a picture first. I had no feelings I was going to be, hurt or anything. I took 4 shots and ran out of film. And again in my mind, take some more pictures. I ran back in, took the last package of Polaroid film out, opened up and crammed it in there. Because the thing's flying around out there, get it quick. It either saw me or whatever, because it started coming. It altered its course. It started coming my direction.
That was November 11th, 1987, about 6 o'clock in the evening. A Gulf Breeze resident, who insists on remaining anonymous, took these photographs. Charlie and Doris Summerby say they saw the same thing that night over East Bay.
And suddenly, Dory said, look. What's that, Charlie? I'll be damned. There were portholes. We saw portholes of light coming out of the portholes.
And over the next 3 months, many more pictures would be taken. By different people. And videotapes, too.
And I feel that there's absolutely no sign of a hoax, that the photographs are genuine, that the witnesses are telling the truth, and that this presents probably the best, without any doubt, the best photographic evidence in 40 years of UFO investigation.
And it's happening right now, and it's time to face the facts. What I'm going to tell you tonight is true beyond a shadow of a doubt, but it's not important that you believe it now. Just listen, file away. In the next few months, maybe even years, you'll wake up one fine day and say to yourself, the son of a gun was right. Of course, by then it'll be far too late. So here's the bottom line. Listen up. Number one, the United States government, since July 7th, 1947, has collected and has in its possession at least 15, but probably closer to 25 flying saucers belonging to alien civilizations from far beyond our solar system. At least 3 were undamaged, and the Air Force has tried to fly at least one of them under a secret program begun in 1972 and continuing to this date at the Nevada test site and Kwajalein Island in the Pacific. Number 2, the United States government has in cryogenic storage at least 30 but maybe closer to 100 alien bodies representing as many as 3 different civilizations from far beyond our solar system. The bodies were or are kept at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Homestead Air Force Base, and there is an alien corpse display at the CIA facility at Langley. At least 3 aliens were captured alive, and 1 is still living at Los Alamos, New Mexico. Their nomenclature or names, they were called EBEs, extraterrestrial biological entities. They were named that by Dr. Detlef Bronk, 6th president of the Johns Hopkins University, who was one of the original MJ-12s. So they called them EBEs, and the ones that they captured were in consecutive order: EBE-1, EBE-2, EBE-3. EBE-1 was captured in 1949, died in 1952, lived with an Air Force colonel. I don't know about EBE-2, EBE-3. I don't know when he was captured, but he's still alive. Number 3, at least 1 million Americans, and probably far more, have been abducted since the early 1940s. These abductions last about 2 hours and are carried out for 3 purposes. The first is to insert a tiny transmitter the size of a BB into the brain of the subject in order to monitor certain biological functions, the specifics of which are unknown to us at this time. The transmitters are implanted at the human beings at about the age of 4 or 5. They are picked up again and checked at about 12 or 13, and about the age of 18, the implant is sometimes removed. Some of you have seen that book, Communion, written by Whitley Strieber. It tells a very fascinating story. He was at the World Life Expo down there in Los Angeles about 6 weeks ago, and he carries around his x-rays with his implants in there, signed by his doctor, 2 unidentified 3-millimeter spherical objects in his brain. The second purpose of the abductions is to program the individual through post-hypnotic suggestion. On the basis of over 300 cases we've discovered so far, we now know that some sort of enormously important event may occur in the next 1 to 4 years, and the abductees have been post-hypnotically programmed to proceed to a certain place and perform a certain function during that event. In some cases, the abductees have been shown what appears to be similar to a little TV channel changer, and advised that at the proper time they will remember what the unit is for and how to work it. Under our best hypnotic techniques, we are unable to find out when or what. There is evidence that the third reason for the abductions is interbreeding or crossbreeding experiments where we have been crossbred with the aliens. In his book Intruders, Bud Hopkins tells about his 2.5-year investigation of Kathy Davis of Indianapolis, who was inseminated by aliens and produced 7 crossbreeds. Number 4, during the past 13 years, over 14,000 cattle throughout the U.S., Canada, and South America have been mutilated in a completely grotesque manner. The mutilations have been investigated by many state and federal agencies, including the FBI, and was the subject of an Emmy Award-winning production called A Strange Harvest, produced by Linda Moulton Howe for the CBS affiliate in Denver. The government issued several press releases blaming the mutilations on predatory animals. However, it was proven that the mutilations were performed using advanced laser surgical equipment which actually cut between the cells of the tissue, a process which is presently beyond our technology, especially in the field. One interesting phenomenon in nearly all the mutilations is that no blood was found in or near the carcasses, and that there was no vascular collapse of the remains. The mutilations have occurred as far north as Canada, where mutilations are classified top secret by the Canadian government, and as far south as Brazil. Over 200 mutilations have occurred this year in a large East Coast city. I'm being given directly the information by the people who are working on it. We know that there's 4 major law enforcement organizations working on it to keep it hidden from the public. They're all working in plain clothes. Number 5, it is unknown exactly which one of the 70 or more alien civilizations which are visiting us at this time are responsible for the mutilations. However, there is private, scientific speculation that these parts and their glandular secretions are used for food and or genetic experiments. Let me show you a little bit about the Strange Harvest, the one that lived
disease, lightning strikes, predator attacks, and other natural causes. But in northeastern Colorado, another favorite spot for the mutilators, Tex Graves, former sheriff of Logan County, insists the 93 mutilated carcasses he investigated were not natural deaths.
The very first one we had was southwest of Sterling. When we first looked at it, it was just unbelievable that you could take an animal and do this too without leaving some kind of track, some kind of evidence behind, such as cigarette butts, matches, handprints, footprints, but there was nothing. The animal looked almost horrible, and it was something that I didn't really want to believe then. And there was, we probably had 5 or 6 others before I really did believe something strange was going on. We had one up north where we believe the animal was paralyzed and was alive when it was being mutilated. An eye and an ear, the tongue, the rectal area was taken out, but the animal dug a hole with its head, but none of the other parts of the body moved, not even the legs. 6 north of town on a very hard pasture, almost like hard brick. We found tripod marks 12 inches across. The tripod marks were 14 feet apart. We found one set that had gone in the ground roughly 8 inches. And it would take a good post hole digger or our shovel to dig in like this. It indicated something very heavy had sat down in this area, yet there was no tracks leading from it nor to it. Almost nightly when this was going on, we could pick out a very brilliant, huge, brilliant light in the sky. We had a newsman take pictures of it with a very high-powered lens, but all we got out of this was the movement of it and the light showing very brilliant. Several times we observed smaller lights come out of this aircraft and then come down toward Earth. This huge, brilliant light would hang in the air, and then when it would move, it could move up and down, backwards, forwards, travel very rapidly, and after a while, these smaller lights would join up with the larger one, and then they'd disappear.
Colorado is the chief investigator for the district attorney's office in Trinidad, Colorado. Extraterrestrials are the ones mutilating animals. What do you think the implications are then for this planet?
Throughout the mutilations, all of us involved have been concerned with the possibility of the mutilations going from animals to human beings, understandably. Thank God to this point it hasn't happened. Whatever they're doing with the portions of these animals they are taking, I haven't the slightest idea. There's a reason for it, not haphazard. There's a pattern to it. I don't know. I think it's a wait-and-see game. What else can we do? If we do have beings from outer space doing this, with the capabilities to do things like this, what can we as a human race do? If they have the knowledge and the technology that it looks like they have, we're powerless. So maybe it's a wait-and-see game. I can't see anything else to do.
This is a computer readout from it's a physics book that they used to give out at the Air Force Academy. It's called Introductory Space Science Volume 2, Department of Physics, United States Air Force, edited by Major Carpenter and Colonel Thurkelson. Chapter 13 was titled Unidentified Flying Objects. In 1972, they took this chapter out of the book because the public was getting hold of it and wanted to have, wanted to see some answers here. And this was a classic Air Force case of the right hand not knowing what the left hand was doing. The people that wrote this didn't know it was a big secret. Anyway, on page 8 of this thing, it takes the Air Force Academy graduate through about 50,000 years of UFO history, from the 47,000-year-old granite carvings of the Hunan province to the Tassili Plateau rock sculptures of 6000 BC, to the story of Ezekiel in 593 BC, to the Irish accounts in 956 AD up through 742 and the UFO over London in that year, on up to 1947 and the Ken Arnold sighting, the Lonnie Zamora incident in Socorro, New Mexico. That was April 24th, 1964. Policeman Lonnie Zamora, who I met on my trip when I took 3.5 weeks out there, he was chasing a speeder, and he saw a little egg-shaped thing come flying across town, and he went after it. It had landed, and two little humanoids had got out, and he parked his car, jumped out, and looked over this bluff where he saw him, and when they saw him, they jumped back in the vehicle and took off. Well, naturally, it created a big deal. The Air Force came down, the FBI came down. He wouldn't change his story. He knew what he saw. There were prints of the landing gear that are still there. I walked out there with Lonnie Zamora here last November, and the FBI put rocks around to protect the area so they could take plaster casts. It's still there. Everything's still there. Anyway, he lost his job, and now he works at the sanitation department there. But takes you through that story, then takes you to the Benny and Barney Hill abduction of September 19th, 1961. This is one of the first abduction cases that was really public, and interesting case about, interesting story about that. Betty Hill, under hypnotic regression, told about an incident when she was on the operating table in the saucer. They had taken a needle and were poking at her stomach, and she says, "What's that?" And they said, "It's a pregnancy test." And she said, "Well, that's nothing we have here on Earth." And she's right. Amniocentesis wasn't invented until 1972. Chapter 13 makes this surprising statement. Right here, Air Force Academy physics book. The most commonly described alien is about 3.5 feet tall, has a round head, arms reaching to or below his knees, and is wearing a silvery spacesuit or coveralls. Other aliens appear to be essentially the same as Earthmen, while still others have particularly wide wraparound eyes or mouths with very thin lips. It's coming right out of an Air Force Academy physics book. And there's a rare group reported as about 4 feet tall, weight of around 35 pounds, and covered with thick hair or fur. Members of this last group are described as being extremely strong. And the Air Force says this doesn't exist? Give me a break. This is a picture of what is known as an EBE. They probably come from a star system known to us as Zeta Reticuli 1 and 2, about 38 light years from here. As you can see, the relative proportions are that of a 5-month fetus. These drawings were made with the help of a CIA informant and the surgeon who performed the autopsy in the late 40s. This surgeon is still alive in California. I'm going to show you a detail of the head. There's quite a large brow. The eyes are quite large, brown in color with no eyelids. Here's a detail of the hand. You can see it has 4 fingers which are slightly webbed, and there's no opposable thumb. There's actually 3 types of these, what we call grays. The ones that Larry Warren saw in Bentwaters have 3 fingers and an opposable thumb, and then there's another type which has 6 fingers. The following were noted during an autopsy by an Army surgeon at the Walter Reed Hospital in the 1940s. 3.5 to 4 feet tall, weight 40 pounds, 2 almond-shaped eyes without pupils, no earlobes, mouth small, appears not to function as a means of communication or a means of food ingestion, arms extending to the knees, the skin is blue-gray, no teeth, no apparent reproductive organs, colorless liquid prevalent in the body without red cells, no water or food intake is known, no digestive tract. Now let's go back to 1947 when the first flying saucer crashed on July 2nd of that year. It crashed about 22 miles southeast of Corona, New Mexico, which is about 70 miles northwest of Roswell. It crashed on the Mac Brazel Ranch. Mac Brazel wasn't actually the Brazel Ranch, he was the foreman. And it was July 2nd, I think it was a Friday, and that was the July 4th weekend, so he didn't get around to going into Roswell until the 6th. When he contacted the sheriff told him to go out to the Air Force Base. He went out to what is known as Walker Field, got with the Chief Intelligence Officer, Jesse Marcel. They went back up to Roswell, loaded all this stuff up in the Jeep, and took it back down to Roswell. Jesse Marcel got in a B-29 with all this stuff and was going to fly it to White Pat. But about halfway, they got orders in the air to land at Carswell. They landed at Carswell, and they were met by a guy named General Alfred Ramey. General Ramey held a press conference, and he's the one that told the public he had some balloon stuff, and he brought that out and said all it was a crashed weather balloon, and the press and the public bought it hook, line, and sinker. When I was on this trip, I talked to Mrs. Floyd Proctor. Floyd Proctor's ranch is right next to Brazel's. When Brazel found this stuff, he brought up some of the stuff and showed it to him, showed him pieces of the saucer. She still remembers that day. I said, did you go down and see it? And she said, no, John, you got to remember in 1947, we were really didn't have enough money to buy the gas to go down. It was about 15 miles away. And she said we didn't understand the importance or the significance of the event. Of course, if it happened today, we'd certainly go down there. But we did feel the stuff. We saw the strange writing. We felt the pieces. And what I'd like to show you now is an interview with Jesse Marcel. Now, there's an interesting thing here. Most of the people that come out and talk about stuff, if they've had direct knowledge and they make a public announcement of any kind, they die shortly thereafter. Jesse Marcel made this for HBO, I think in 1984, and died shortly thereafter. Why do you...
Europe went into high gear with the Roswell, New Mexico incident in July 1947. Roswell was the site of an Army Air Force base 118 miles from the atomic testing grounds at Alamogordo and only 220 miles from Los Alamos, birthplace of the atomic bomb. On July 2nd, this rancher, Mac Brazel, saw something crash in a field outside town. Brazel died in 1963, having kept a pledge to the Air Force to keep secret the story of what really happened in this field. Brazel talked to only one person about those events, his son, Bill, now 60 years old. He told him that whatever crashed here was something he could not identify.
According to my dad, there was a bad thunderstorm the night before. The next day, he was out on the ranch, and he found this debris. And he picked it all up in his pickup and was talking to people, and of course there was some talk about UFOs. He was going to Roswell, and as far as I know, he got in touch with the Sheriff's Department. They in turn called the Air Force. Then the Air Force got with Dad and swore him to secrecy, and they came out to the ranch and picked up this debris.
Major Jesse Marcel, the chief intelligence officer at the base, was assigned the task of collecting the debris from the crash site. His selection for the job, UFO proponents say, is proof that the Air Force knew from the start that this was something out of the ordinary. Marcel tells us what he found in that field.
None of the materials that we picked up weighed anything. Looked like it was weightless. You couldn't feel that you had anything in your hands.
The wood, I call it wood, I don't know what it was. It was something like balsa wood, but it wouldn't burn, and I couldn't cut it with my knife.
I found one piece of metal, what looked like metal anyway. It was not flexible, but it was as thin as a foil in a pack of cigarettes. It was that thin. One of my boys told me, he said, there's something unusual here. He said, I tried to make a dent in this metal. And he says, you can't bend it. You can't make a mark on it. He says, I took a sledgehammer and whammed it. I put it on the ground and whammed it. The sledgehammer bounced off of it.
When Major Marcel reported his findings to officials back at the base, they issued a startling press release. They had a flying saucer. The next day, Major Marcel was assigned to take the remains of the crashed objects to Wright Field in Ohio for further examination. However, the plane landed at Carswell Air Force Base in Fort Worth, Texas. General Alfred Ramey took one piece of the object off the plane and called a press conference. Then Major Marcel was given different orders by Ramey. He was not to continue on to Wright Field.
He told me not to say anything. He says, I'll handle it from now on. And that's exactly what he did. When he came out, he said, he told the press that was there, He said that was nothing but a weather balloon, crashed weather balloon.
Marcel, under orders not to say what he believed, only recently spoke out against the Air Force's revised story.
It was definitely not a weather balloon. And it was an aircraft. So what it could have been, I wouldn't know. I still don't know.
Mac Brazel, who had a rancher's knowledge of such things, told his son that, like Major Marcel, he knew the object was not a weather balloon.
He said that's what the Air Force tried to make him believe, that it was a weather balloon. And he said, Bill, he said, it was not a weather balloon. He said, I don't know what it was. But he said it was something altogether different and much bigger.
All these years, what is the big deal? I mean, we've been, flat lied to. Well, consider, if you will, the position of the United States government at the time this happened. They proudly thought of themselves as the most powerful nation on earth, having recently produced the atomic bomb and won World War II with it. They had built a jet aircraft that was in 4 months going to exceed the speed of sound in flight. They had built bombers of intercontinental range that could carry weapons of enormous destruction. The post-war era had brought economic prosperity, and the future seemed bright. Now imagine what it was like for those same leaders, all of whom had witnessed the panic of the Orson Welles broadcast of the War of the Worlds in 1938. Thousands of Americans had panicked at a realistically presented invasion of Earth by beings of another planet. Imagine their horror as they actually viewed the dead bodies of the real aliens, frightening little creatures with enormous eyes, reptilian skin, and claws at the end of their fingers. Imagine their shock as they attempted to determine how these strange saucers were powered and could discover no part even remotely similar to components that they were familiar with. No cylinders, no pistons, no vacuum tubes, no turbines, no hydraulic actuators. It's only when you fully understand the overwhelming helplessness the government was faced with in the summer of 1947 can you comprehend their perceived need for a total, thorough, and sweeping cover-up to include the use of deadly force. The cover-up was so successful that as late as 1985, a senior scientist with the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California, Dr. Al Hibbs, would look at a videotape, which we're going to see later, of an enormous flying saucer over the Hudson Valley and state for the record, I'm not going to assign anything to the UFO phenomena without a lot more data. Dr. Hibbs was looking at the naked emperor and saying, well, he certainly looks naked, but that doesn't prove he is naked. This enormous cover-up was initiated on September 24th, 1947, by President Truman by an executive order which established a group of 12 top military, scientific, and intelligence personnel of their time. They were known as the MJ-12. Although the group exists today, none of the original members is still alive. The last one to die was a guy named Gordon Gray, died in 1984. As each member passed away, another member was appointed to fill the position. The group today is composed of more members of the original 12 than the original 12, and among those who are thought to be current members are Dr. Kissinger, Dr. Ed Teller, General Lou Allen, and Admiral Bobby Inman. On November 18th, 1952, President-elect Dwight David Eisenhower was briefed on Majestic 12 and the cover-up by Admiral Roscoe H. Hillenkotter. Admiral Hillenkotter was MJ-1 and had been director of the Central Intelligence Agency from May of 1947 until September of 1950. This is a copy of that briefing. Copy is up there on that board. This copy was sent to a Los Angeles man named Jamie Chandra, a man active in UFO research. It came through the mail in a plain brown envelope as a roll of undeveloped 35mm black and white film. The first 8 frames contained the document, then there were 5 blank frames, and then there were 8 frames of the documents again. The briefing outlines the history of the flying saucer recovery and the current members of MJ-12. Who sent the document? We don't know. We know that part of MJ-12 wants the truth out, part doesn't. MJ-12, we know, has become military top-heavy over the past 20 years, and we all know that the military does not want to admit a mistake. But somebody is trying to help us. Warning, top secret, eyes-only document containing compartmentalized information essential to the national security of the United States. Eyes-only access to the material herein is strictly limited to those possessing Majestic 12 clearance level. Reproduction in any form or the taking of written or mechanical transcribed notes is strictly forbidden. Copy 1 of 1. Briefing Officer, Admiral Roscoe H. Hillencotter, MJ-1. Operation Majestic 12 is a top secret research and development intelligence operation responsible directly and only to the President of the United States. Operations of the project are carried out under the control of Majestic 12, which was established by special classified executive order of President Truman on 24th, 1947. And here's a list of the original members. Admiral Roscoe Hillencotter, Dr. Vannevar Bush, Secretary James Forrestal. Remember what happened to him? Committed suicide in 1950. General Nathan Twining, General Hoyt Vandenberg, Dr. Detlef Bronk, he's the guy that named the EBEs. Dr. Jerome Hunsaker, Mr. Sidney Sowers, Mr. Gordon Gray, Mr. Donald Menzel. Anybody remember Menzel? Menzel was the guy in the 50s who debunked flying saucers. Nah, they don't exist. He wrote 3 books that said they didn't exist. General Robert M. Montague, Dr. Lloyd V. Bertner. Then it goes on to say the history. Talks about June 24th, 1947, civilian pilot flying over the Cascade Mountains in the state of Washington observed 9 flying disc-shaped aircraft traveling in formation at a high rate of speed. That was Ken Arnold. We have a relative of Ken Arnold who's in the audience today. Although this was not the first known sighting of such object, it was the first to gain widespread attention in the public media. A number of witnesses were interviewed, and there were several unsuccessful attempts to utilize aircraft in efforts to pursue reported discs of flight. Public reaction bordered on near hysteria at times. In spite of these efforts, little of substance was learned about the objects until a local rancher reported one had crashed in a remote region of New Mexico. On July 7, 1947, a secret operation was begun to assure the recovery of the wreckage of this object for scientific study. During the course of the operation, aerial reconnaissance discovered that 4 small human-like beings had apparently ejected from the craft at some point before it exploded. Goes on to talk about a covert analytical effort organized by General Twining and Dr. Bush, acting on the direct orders of the President, resulted in a preliminary consensus that the disc was most likely a short-range reconnaissance craft. And it talks about the 4 dead occupants were examined by Dr. Bronk and what he named them. Since it is virtually certain that these craft do not originate in any country on Earth, considerable speculation has centered around what their point of origin might have been and how they got here. Numerous examples of what appear to be forms of writing were found in the wreckage. Efforts to decipher these have remained largely unsuccessful. Then they attach enumeration of the attachments, which we didn't get. We did get one. It was number 1, and it was where President Truman established the MJ-12. On White House stationary top secret eyes only. September 24th, 1947, memorandum for the Secretary of Defense. Dear Secretary Forrestal, as per our recent conversation on this